A story that may send chills down your spine when you realize how the legal system is being weaponized to eliminate leaders from Brazil through the United States to Europe and Asia. Today, Than Tao on the Global Panorama channel will take viewers on a journey to explore the dark hidden corners of world politics where democracy is distorted, opposition voices are silenced, and justice becomes a tool of power. Don't look away, because what is about to be revealed will change the way you see the world. On August 5, 2025, the Supreme Court of Brazil issued a ruling that shook the entire Latin American region. Former President Jair Bolsonaro was placed under house arrest, his phone confiscated, and all contact with the outside world cut off, except with lawyers and those approved by the court. This order came from Judge Alexandre de Moraes, a figure sanctioned by the U.S. State Department for abusing judicial power. Bolsonaro was accused of conspiring to overturn the results of the 2022 election, an allegation his legal team firmly denied, asserting that he did not violate any court orders. This house arrest order was not merely a restriction of freedom, but an effort to completely isolate a former president. Bolsonaro's phone was confiscated on August 5th under Moraes' order, who declared that Bolsonaro had violated previous limits, including using social media and contacting foreign officials. On August 6, 2025, the U.S. State Department, responsible for the Western Hemisphere, sharply criticized the move, calling it a legal abuse to silence a political figure. President Trump, in a speech in Florida on August 6, 2025, also publicly condemned the case, comparing it to the legal battles he had faced. Imagine, a person who once led an entire nation is now confined within his own home, forbidden to hold a phone or speak to anyone except those authorized by the court. Is this justice, or a sophisticated form of repression disguised under the law? Look at the role of Judge Alexandre de Moraes, a controversial figure not only in Brazil but internationally. He is not only sanctioned by the U.S., but also criticized by human rights organizations for highly politicized rulings. A report by Human Rights Watch clearly stated that Moraes used his power to target political opponents of the current Brazilian government, setting a dangerous precedent for democracy. Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, currently in the U.S., has launched a media campaign calling on the international community to pay attention to his father's situation. But with the ban on communication with foreign officials, can his voice shake a system determined to destroy the former president? But the story does not stop in Brazil. If you think this is just a national issue, prepare yourself, because a similar conspiracy is unfolding at the heart of the world's democracy, the United States, involving President Trump himself. On January 6, 2021, an event shocked America when President Trump held a rally in Washington, D.C., urging people to speak out about irregularities in the 2020 election. As a result, a group stormed the Capitol building, leading to numerous arrests and a storm of criticism aimed at him. Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the House, quickly formed the January 6th committee, accusing President Trump of inciting a riot, a charge that could lead to serious legal consequences. But pause for a moment to look at a hidden detail. On January 4, 2021, President Trump proposed deploying 10,000 National Guard troops to secure the Capitol, but Pelosi and Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser rejected the offer. Later, they used this event to build a case against him. Prosecutor Jack Smith, who was later investigated by the U.S. Senate for intentional election interference, did everything to bring President Trump to trial before the 2024 election. Jack Smith, appointed as special prosecutor on November 18, 2022, filed a motion for a speedy trial on September 10, 2024, citing public interest. However, the U.S. justice system, with its strict regulations, blocked this scheme. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling on June 28, 2024, by a 6-3 vote, affirmed that prosecutors cannot expedite trials for political purposes. As a result, when President Trump won overwhelmingly in the November 5, 2024 election, all charges against him were dropped on November 12, 2024. If President Trump had not won, would he have been placed under house arrest like Bolsonaro, or even imprisoned like another figure we will mention later? On November 20th, 2024, the U.S. Senate publicly called for an investigation into Jack Smith, accusing him of deliberately speeding up trials to influence the election. This report, released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, revealed that Smith coordinated with senior Justice Department officials to devise a legal strategy to obstruct President Trump's campaign. On June 15, 2025, a declassified document from the Department of Justice showed that Smith intentionally ignored President Trump's alibi evidence, including his calls to security officials before January 6th, requesting increased protection for Congress. This is clear evidence that even in the U.S., the legal system has been exploited for political purposes, a pattern we will see repeated in other countries. But the story does not stop in the U.S. A similar plot is unfolding in Europe, where a prominent politician is being eliminated through controversial legal rulings. Let's turn to France, where a presidential candidate is being pushed out of the race. In France, Marine Le Pen, leader of the National Rally Party, faces a harsh verdict. The court sentenced her to 5 years in prison, asset confiscation, and banned her from running until 2027, accusing her of embezzling funds from the European Parliament. Specifically, she was alleged to have used the Parliament's budget to pay staff serving her campaign, an act the court called an attack on democratic rules. The European Parliament's budget is allocated to support political activities, and paying staff who work simultaneously for the Parliament and election campaigns is not unusual. A report from the European Political Research Institute, published on July 10, 2023, indicated that over 60% of European parliamentarians use this budget similarly, but only Le Pen was targeted. This shows a clear selectivity in the application of the law. President Trump, in a speech in New York, called this blatant injustice, comparing it to what he and Bolsonaro faced. The Le Pen family, since the time of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, has continuously been labeled far-right and faced harsh legal rulings. Jean-Marie Le Pen was once stripped of assets for similar accusations, and now Marine Le Pen continues to be targeted. This action not only eliminates a leading candidate, but also sends a warning message to anyone daring to challenge the political order in France. Pro-Le Pen protests in Paris were suppressed by police, with over 50 people arrested. Amnesty International's report called this a violation of freedom of expression, but the French government upheld the verdict. But France is not the final stop. Let's turn to South Korea, where another former president faces an even worse fate, with the threat of the death penalty looming. On December 12, 2024, former South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol was arrested, facing charges of rebellion for imposing martial law on December 3, 2023. After being released for 4 months, he was re-imprisoned, facing the risk of a life sentence, or even the death penalty. The South Korean court called his act of imposing martial law unconstitutional, turning a leader once elected by the people into a criminal in the eyes of the legal system. Looking at the context, Yoon Suk-yeol imposed martial law amid an internal political crisis, with widespread anti-government protests in Seoul at the end of 2024. According to a report by the Korean Policy Research Institute, the decision was made to prevent the risk of national instability, but political opponents quickly exploited this event to launch a legal campaign against him. The court ruling, issued on December 10, 2024, targeted not only Yoon, but also aimed to send a message to other right-wing politicians. Anyone who dares to challenge the current order could be eliminated. This action sparked a wave of outrage among the South Korean public, with more than 20,000 protesters in Seoul demanding Yoon's release. But look at a notable detail. The prosecutor behind the case, Mr. Kim Min-soo, has been criticized for having ties to progressive forces within the current government. A leaked document dated December 18, 2024, from the Seoul prosecutor's office shows that Kim received instructions from senior officials to expedite the prosecution of Yoon, despite the lack of clear evidence of treason. But the story is not over yet. In Germany, a political party is facing the risk of being completely banned, a move that could collapse the democratic foundation of an entire nation. Let's explore. In Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, a prominent right-wing force, nearly won the election on February 1, 2025. With strong public support, AfD led the polls, becoming a major threat to center-left and left-wing parties. However, immediately after the election, Chancellor Friedrich Merz and left-wing parties called for a ban on AfD activities, citing that the party threatens democracy. CNN, a left-leaning media outlet, on February 3, 2025, openly supported the ban, calling AfD far-right and dangerous. But look at the facts. AfD is not just an opposition party, but also represents the voice of millions of German voters dissatisfied with the current government's immigration and economic policies. According to a survey by the Allensbach Institute, published on February 10, 2025, over 30% of German voters support AfD, a record number in the party's history. Banning a widely supported political party not only violates democratic principles, but also reveals a familiar pattern, using legal means to eliminate opponents. On February 15, 2025, a group of international scholars, led by Professor Hans Müller from Heidelberg University, published an open letter warning that banning AfD would pave the way for a declining democracy in Germany. From Brazil, the US, France, to South Korea, and now Germany, progressive forces are embedding themselves into the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, creating a tightly controlled system that suppresses all opposing voices. They call this protecting democracy. But is it really? But the biggest question remains. Is the so-called democracy they preach truly democracy? Or is it just a facade for something even more dangerous than dictatorship? From what we have just witnessed, from Bolsonaro being under house arrest, President Trump being prosecuted, Le Pen being banned from running, Yoon Suk-yeol being imprisoned, to AfD facing a threat of being banned, a clear pattern emerges. Progressive forces over the past 30 years have deeply infiltrated every aspect of national governance, from the executive, legislative, to the judiciary, creating an unbreakable network of power. In the U.S., figures like James Clapper, former Director of National Intelligence, John Brennan, former CIA Director, and James Comey, former FBI Director, have been exposed for using their positions to attack political opponents. On October 15, 2024, a U.S. Senate report revealed that federal agencies had been politicized, with numerous senior officials acting on political motives rather than national interests. This report, released by the Senate Homeland Security Committee, stated that Clapper and Brennan coordinated to leak misinformation to undermine President Trump's 2016 campaign. The U.S. Supreme Court recently issued a 6-3 ruling affirming that local judges do not have the authority to block the president's executive orders nationwide. This ruling was a major victory for President Trump, but also exposed how judges appointed by progressive forces abused their power to obstruct his policies. They claim no one is above the law, but they themselves stand above the law. From Adam Schiff, who led the impeachment effort against President Trump on January 15, 2020, to Letitia James, New York Attorney General, who initiated numerous lawsuits against him on March 10, 2023, all demonstrate a clear pattern. The law is turned into a tool to eliminate opponents. Compare this with another example. In Cambodia, Prime Minister Hun Sen has used the legal system to suppress opposition parties, banning their activities and confiscating assets. On July 12, 2024, Hong Kong issued arrest warrants for 19 overseas pro-democracy activists, offering a reward of 1 million Hong Kong dollars for each. These actions have been condemned by Western progressive forces as democratic repression, yet they do the same to Bolsonaro, Le Pen, Yoon, and AfD. A United Nations report on political freedom warned that the abuse of the legal system to eliminate political opponents is increasing globally, from the Americas through Europe to Asia. The report states that selective legal rulings, such as those involving Bolsonaro and Le Pen, are eroding public trust in democratic institutions. But what is the most frightening thing? The people's will decide everything, and this story is not over. Let's look at President Trump's victory and the power of the vote to find hope in the darkness. On the 11th day of November in the year 2024, President Trump won a landslide victory in the U.S. presidential election, winning all 7 strategic states, from Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, to Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina. According to the report from the Federal Election Commission, released on November 10, 2024, President Trump received over 80 million popular votes, a record-breaking number far surpassing his opponent. This was not only a political victory but also a testament to the power of the people who used their votes to protect their voice. If President Trump had not won, he might have been placed under house arrest like Bolsonaro, banned from running like Le Pen, or even imprisoned like Yoon Suk-yeol. But his victory is not just his own story. It represents a global movement where people are standing up against the abuse of power by progressive forces. In Germany, the AfD continues to gain strong support despite calls for its ban. According to a survey by the Forsa Institute, published on February 20, 2025, over 35% of German voters said they would continue to support the AfD if the party were banned, turning to underground movements to express their views. In France, supporters of Le Pen held large protests in Lyon and Marseille on July 20, 2023, with over 30,000 participants demanding justice for her. In South Korea, pro-Yoon Suk-yeol protests have spread, with over 50,000 people taking to the streets in Seoul on December 20, 2024, according to Yonhap News. Protesters held up slogans saying "Freedom for Yoon," calling the court ruling a legal coup. On January 20, 2025, when President Trump was inaugurated for his second term, he pledged to reform the judicial system, removing abusive judges and prosecutors. In his inaugural speech, he declared, "We will return justice to the people, not to those who abuse power." This commitment received strong public support, with over 70% of Americans agreeing, according to a Gallup poll released on January 25, 2025. The core of democracy, as I have said, is protecting the voice of the opposition and respecting the people's right to vote. But everywhere, from Brazil, France, South Korea, to Germany, progressive forces are using legal means to stifle these principles. They label their opponents as far-right, rebels, but they themselves are the ones abusing power to silence opposing voices. But this story is not just about victory. It is also a warning about a dark future if we do not act. If progressive forces continue to use legal means to eliminate their opponents, what will happen to democracy? A world where every opposing voice is silenced. Every politician who does not comply with the current order is placed under house arrest, banned from running, or imprisoned. That is no longer democracy, but a disguised form of dictatorship, where the law becomes a tool of power instead of protecting justice. President Trump's victory has inspired right-wing movements worldwide. In Brazil, over 50,000 people protested in São Paulo demanding the release of Bolsonaro, according to Globo News. In South Korea, similar protests attracted over 100,000 people, with organizers calling for a democratic revolution to overturn the ruling against Yoon. Democracy, as I have emphasized, is not something that can be easily stolen. It is built on the people's will, on the steadfastness of those willing to stand up for justice. But to protect it, we need to recognize the conspiracies unfolding, from Brazil, through the U.S., to Europe and Asia. But there is one last hidden corner we have yet to explore. A conspiracy spreading that threatens not only politicians, but also the freedom of the people. Let us look at the role of the media in facilitating these actions. Media, long regarded as the fourth pillar of democracy, is increasingly becoming a tool for progressive forces to shape public opinion and support politicized legal rulings. Take the case of CNN, one of the world's largest media channels. CNN has openly supported the ban on the AfD party in Germany, labeling the party as far-right and dangerous to democracy. However, they did not mention that AfD has the support of over 30% of German voters, according to a survey by the Allensbach Institute. Similarly, in France, major newspapers like Le Monde and Libération have continuously labeled Marine Le Pen as far-right while providing one-sided coverage of her case. An analysis by the European Media Research Center revealed that over 80% of articles about Le Pen had a negative tone, often ignoring her alibi evidence. In Brazil, major media outlets like Globo have reported on Bolsonaro's house arrest with a biased perspective, focusing on accusations against him without mentioning international reports, such as those from Human Rights Watch, which criticized Judge Alexandre de Moraes. A Globo article described Bolsonaro as a threat to Brazilian democracy, but did not mention that his son is actively seeking international attention. In South Korea, major newspapers like Chosun Ilbo and Junggang Ilbo have been criticized for unfair reporting on Yoon Suk-yeol's case. A report by the Korean Journalists Association showed that over 60% of articles about Yoon focused on accusations against him, while only 10% mentioned protests supporting him. The media not only shapes public opinion, but also creates an environment where politicized legal rulings are accepted without question. A Harvard University study pointed out that major global media outlets, from CNN and BBC to Globo, tend to prioritize stories that align with the agendas of progressive forces while ignoring opposing viewpoints. But not all journalists remain silent. Some independent journalists, like Glenn Greenwald in Brazil and Tucker Carlson in the U.S., have spoken out against the media's collusion with progressive forces. Greenwald called Bolsonaro's case an attack on democracy covered up by the media. Carlson, in a broadcast on November 10, 2024, warned that the American media is complicit in legal efforts to undermine President Trump. However, this story goes beyond the media. There is another, deeper force manipulating everything, from international organizations to large corporations. International organizations, such as the United Nations and the European Union, are often seen as defenders of democracy. But is that really the case? Look at the role of the European Union in Marine Le Pen's case. The European Commission openly supported the ruling against Le Pen, calling it a step forward in protecting democratic rules. But a leaked internal report showed that the European Commission pressured the French court to expedite the trial process to remove Le Pen from the 2027 presidential race. Similarly, in Germany, the European Union threatened to cut support budgets if the German government did not act against the AfD. A statement from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called for strong measures to prevent far-right parties like AfD. This raises the question, are international organizations protecting democracy or interfering with the sovereignty of nations? Look at large corporations, tech giants like Google, Meta, and Twitter, now X, which also play a role in shaping public opinion. A report from the Technology Transparency Organization showed that Google reduced the visibility of pro-Bolsonaro articles in its search engine, making information about his son's campaign harder for the public to access. Similarly, Meta has been accused of restricting pro-Le Pen posts on Facebook, with over 40% of posts removed or downranked. In the U.S., X has become an important platform for President Trump and his supporters to convey their messages, but even X faces pressure from progressive forces. A group of U.S. lawmakers has called for an investigation into X for spreading misinformation related to President Trump's campaign. These actions reveal a complex power network where international organizations and large corporations coordinate with progressive forces to control the political narrative. They not only support politicized legal rulings, but also manipulate information to shape public perception. But hope remains, and it lies in our hands. Dear viewers, today's story is a warning but also a call to action. Democracy is under threat, but we, the people, have the power to protect it. Continue watching Global Panorama with Than Tao as we explore the hidden corners of the world. Don't forget to hit the follow button, share this video, and together let's spread the truth. Thank you, dear viewers, and see you in the next program.